The first part of individual learning differences 3 is learner as a social being, as well as the understanding of stereotyping and generalization. Language as a social practice. In order to understand learner as a social being, first of all, let's try to figure out what we mean by learning or language in the context of social scenario. Language as a social practice, if we want to understand, we must pay our attention towards the understanding of language and how it works in a society. Language is not viewed as a simple code which only involves learning vocabulary and the rules for constructing sentences. So if you look at language as just the constituent of linguistic units, that you have morphology, phonology, semantic, syntactic characteristics, then it's a very limited view of language. We need to go out of beyond this and try to understand what role it plays as far as social context is concerned. It's not simply mastery of vocabulary or vocabulary item or general awareness of how to construct sentences, rather how it is used for meaningful purposes. Language is a dynamic process of communication, a social practice of meaning making and interpretation. So when we are looking at language in the social context, we really need to understand that it's a process of making meaning, which means that in order to convey meaning, you form meaning, and that meaning is conveyed through language, and then the key lies in the correct, accurate interpretation of the linguistic meaning as well as the social meaning. When language is used to construct our messages according to our intentions, our constraints and possibilities, our roles and relationship, it becomes a social practice. So language, to be a social practice, has to take into account all the constraints that we follow in the forming of our meaning, our intentions, the possibilities and the roles of relationship, not only the speaker sender in terms of the relationship that speaker has with the recipient and with the environment that in which he or she is communicating. That constructs social practice of a language. Learner's social status, class, identity, power, gender, ethnicity contribute significantly in making a learner a social being. So since learner is an active participant in this role of language as a medium of communication, we see that learners own a social status in the class he or she belongs to. Then the ethnicity, which means the religious and cultural values that he carries, the power, the identity, all these elements contribute immensely in making or forming learner's social identity. Since second language, learner is actively engaged in this process, social network and social practices, therefore he/she is also considered as social being. Participation is key towards making any learner a social being. Learner is required to participate in the process of communication, and that is how he or she can assert his or herself and be a prominent member of that social class. Learner as a social being inculcates values of culture, self-concept, tolerance of ambiguity, and empathy in the learning process. So learner as a social being can inculcate all the social values that he has, the empathizing factor that he or she should have this ability to put himself or herself in others' shoes, and also the values of the culture in the very process of learning a language, and that should be reflected in his or her behavior. From teaching point of view, a professional stance that understands language as a social practice requires students to engage in tasks in which they create and interpret meaning. So it is the requirement and it is the task for the teachers to create an environment where they can create and interpret meaning, and in which they communicate their own personal meanings and develop personal connection with the new language. So the opportunities should be social-based, social activities should be administered where students or learners should be provided with ample opportunities to develop personal connections with the new language. Cramsch knows that talk about talk is what the classroom does best, and yet this potential source of knowledge has not been sufficiently tapped even in communicatively oriented classroom. So basically, communication is what has been emphasized by Cramps, that talk, which means providing students with communicative framework to deliver, should be the task of the learning teacher or teaching of the second language teachers, but yet this particular aspect has not been fully utilized. Learners require learning skills which will give them independence as users and analyzers of language. So the students require to develop skills which should enable them to analyze and the analyzers independently. If you look at this figure over here, you would see these different circles providing learner with the framework to develop or to be a part of a social structure and to be a social being. People and settings that are most closely involved with student is the family, school, peers, and then though their daily contact with parents, career, family and staff as well as their peers, they learn about the social world and about the rules, practices and values that support it by actively participating. Then in addition, the learner's development is influenced by a wider network of social support that is represented in the central circle, included extended family and then friends and then a school and sporting social groups and all that. Now in the outer circle, we see lives are shaped by the broader social circumstances, which are media, cultural values, parents, employment, religious communities, economic issues, social health advice, environment. So these are there. You can see different levels which can contribute and which can elicit learners' participation and can contribute in making learner a social being. Then we have stereotyping and generalization. Stereotyping is basically comes from social psychology, and that is our perceptions of group members, the positive or negative beliefs that we hold about certain characteristics of social group. Now, in this particular phenomena, what we do is that we categorize people based on their personality, based on their traits, and categorization is easy because you make, by labeling somebody, you make it very easy to understand. But this stereotyping has lots of disadvantages that we will be discussing later on. Generalization is the process of identifying the parts of a whole as belonging to the whole. So basically, it's a broader domain where based on the parts of understanding of certain parts of the whole, you form the perception that the complete whole is something like that. Our statements, beliefs of a group or people, although factual, but might not be true of every single person that belongs to that group. So when we are generalizing, the danger is that we are putting everybody in that frame, which might not be true of every single individual. So you see that stereotypes are harmful because they are used unconsciously and reactively. It's a reaction to certain characteristics. Generalizations are helpful because they are used consciously and through lots of deliberation and analysis. Stereotypes are judgmental. You form an opinion and then you stick to it and you do not change, whereas generalization is more descriptive and flexible and it is accurate. This is very simple because you simply label somebody with some stereotyping labels, and here you see an attempt to capture similarities and principles. Stereotyping are fixed and not open to revisiting, no modification, whereas generalizations are constantly modified with new input. To conclude, learner is an active participant in social world and uses language as a vehicle of communication. Stereotypes are oversimplification of a group's characteristics based on opinions, whereas generalization are more neutral and tend to draw conclusion based on facts and large number of people.